I woke up drenched in a cold sweat. Moonlight was flooding in through the blinds, and a distant rumble was foreshadowing rain. The bedsheet stuck to my skin as I felt under the covers for my phone, the sudden bright light making me flinch. It was 4:34 a.m., only 10 minutes later than the previous night. I sunk back into my pillow, exasperated. I'd been having the same dream for the better half of the week. Well, more of a nightmare, really. It always started out quite pleasant. I'd be sitting at a diner, enjoying a filet mignon and a glass of red wine, when the little gold bell above the door would ring, and a man would step inside. He'd walk up to the bar and whisper to the waitress, and then they would both turn and look at me. Suddenly, my food would taste bitter, and I'd look down only to see the vermin defiling my plate. At first, I thought the universe might be trying to tell me something. I'd looked up bad dream interpretations online, hoping to shed some light on my subconscious. But the only explanation I had found was adamant about the presence of a toxic relationship. I couldn't take it seriously after that. Jimmy and I had been over for nearly 3 years, and I had been the one to call it quits after he'd surprised me with a shared burial plot for Valentine's Day. I winced at that memory. Certainly, I had better things to do than reminisce, and I knew sleep wouldn't find me again, so I threw on my nightrobe and trudged downstairs in search of breakfast. It was only 8 o'clock in the morning, but the office was already bustling with energy. As soon as I stepped out from the elevator, William rushed over to share the latest statistical reports. I furrowed my brow. Can't these wait? He clicked his tongue impatiently.
Afraid not. Pete wants him in by noon.
He shoved the folder at me and disappeared into one of the adjoining rooms. I wrung my hands in frustration. I was going to be doing interviews today, and I hadn't even had so much as a whiff of my morning coffee. Amelia was already waiting for me as I stormed into the room.
Right. You have 2 missed calls, a meeting with Harvey E. after lunch, and 3 applicants starting at 9 o'clock.
She sounded as though she'd been rehearsing it for the past half hour. Amelia was our most recent hire. She was fresh out of college and clearly had no idea what she was doing. Right. I slapped the reports folder onto the table. I am dying for a coffee. Would you be so kind? I didn't even have to finish my sentence. Amelia was out the door, and I heard the click-clack of her heels down the corridor. She had returned shortly after I sat down at my desk.
The first interviewee is here,
she announced in her high-pitched tone. I glanced at my watch. It was only 20 past 8. The interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock, I pointed out matter-of-factly. Amelia blushed and tugged at the hem of her skirt.
They're very eager to meet you.
Her tone was almost apologetic. I sighed and waved my hand dismissively. All right then, call them in. I shifted some papers around on my desk impatiently as Amelia strutted down the corridor. Within 20 seconds, there was a light knock on my door. Come on in, I called. I was expecting a fidgety, high-strung individual, but he was tall and lean, with deep chestnut hair gelled neatly into place. He looked about 35. I stood to greet him and gestured to the empty chair facing me. Take a seat, please. I couldn't help noticing how self-assured he was. Both his stride and the classic fit suit he was wearing radiated confidence. I consulted my applicant list and put on my best "I love my job" smile. How are you today, Chris? I hoped I'd gotten his name right. Amelia had forgotten to give me the heads up, but he seemed totally unfazed.
I'm doing great. How are you?
He leaned back in his chair, a relaxed grin on his face. His features seemed vaguely familiar, giving me an odd sense of déjà vu. I was generally rather good with faces and hated not being able to pinpoint it. What if he was expecting me to recognize him? Quickly, I ran down a mental list of places I'd visited over the past few days. Had I seen him in the milk aisle in Junebury? Or was he the guy who ran out of change at the gas station on 5th? Actually, hadn't he gone out with my friend Lisa last month?
Have I messed up already?
He was eyeing me quizzically, a smirk lining his features. I caught a glimpse of myself in my laptop screen. My brow was furrowed, my lips pursed. Come to think of it, I probably looked quite angry. No, not at all. I chuckled awkwardly and clicked my tongue. Let me introduce myself, Chris. My name is Madeline, and I am responsible for our HR department. As you are undoubtedly aware, we are currently looking for someone with previous experience in the field to fill our customer representative position. I looked at him expectantly.
Very well.
He grinned, a dimple forming in his cheek.
I believe I am qualified for the job.
Well, your resume certainly looks impressive. I tapped the printout with my fingernail. It says here you graduated from...
With honors.
He cut me off, nodding amiably. He looked so at ease it was challenging for me to maintain my professional composure. And it says here, I looked up at him, you spent 10 years working for a communications company. Could you tell me a bit about your position there?
I was their customer service representative. Mostly dealt with returns and, well, snappy clients.
He chuckled to himself.
There is a letter of recommendation on the second page.
I couldn't help smiling. Okay, Chris, so what sets you apart from the other applicants? Why should we hire you? I observed him curiously. It was a trick question, but he took no time to think.
I'm very thorough with my work. I commit until the end and hold myself to a very high standard.
He paused thoughtfully.
I'm also a brilliant magician. I collect vinyl records and grill a mean steak.
I froze as the last puzzle piece fell into place. Steak. That was where I remembered him from. The man who had been haunting my dreams every night for the past week was sitting in front of me with a grin on his face and asking for a job. A mix of anticipation and apprehension washed over me as questions flooded my mind. Was I a psychic? Should I be worried? Should this affect my decision?
Is everything all right?
He looked bemused. It's nothing. I was aware I was stumbling over my words. Thank you for coming in today, Chris. You can come sign the paperwork tomorrow morning. I'll make sure Amelia gets it ready for you. His face lit up.
I got the job?
I stood up and held my hand out to him. Welcome aboard. He happily obliged, shaking my hand and gathering his belongings to leave. But he must have changed his mind on the way because he suddenly turned to face me, an odd look in his eyes. Did you have a question, Chris? He winced slightly at my impatient tone.
I did, actually.
He paused for effect.
A restaurant has just opened on Valewood Avenue. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner this evening.
I was so taken aback, I felt my cheeks flame red. That's very thoughtful of you, Chris, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline. Our company doesn't condone workplace romances. I was half expecting him to apologize and move on, but he continued standing there, as if he hadn't even heard me.
Actually, I see it as more of a potential business venture.
He explained.
I figured since they're a new company, we could make a pitch. They don't open until 6, so we'd have to go during after hours anyway.
In spite of myself, I felt a pang of dismay. Well, in that case, I'd be happy to come along. We sat across from one another in the dimly lit bistro. The place was bustling with life. Waiters were circling around the tables, and the booths were filled with the sound of clinking glasses and happy chatter. A small queue had formed by the front entrance, and I thought to myself that we had been lucky to even get a table. Chris had ordered a bottle of wine and leaned back in his seat, sipping it.
What do you think?
His eyes gleamed. I nodded approvingly. We should make an offer. He chuckled cordially.
But what do you think of the wine?
Oh, I stiffened. It's delicious, of course.
It's very good.
He agreed.
So, tell me, Madeline, what does a high flyer like yourself do outside of the office?
There was a twinkle in his eye for a second. I felt at a loss for words. This was supposed to be a business meeting, after all. But Chris seemed set on steering the conversation away from work. Well, I do yoga on the weekends, and, I gestured expressively. I suppose reading could be considered one of my main pastimes. I took a sip of wine hurriedly. I didn't like how limited my vocabulary was around Chris. It didn't help that he was conventionally attractive and well-spoken. I had agreed to accompany him on this business endeavor, but Chris didn't look as though he'd had any intention on making a pitch anytime soon, nor could I do anything about it. He was the customer representative, after all.
Are you ready to order?
A waiter in a green apron towered over the table. Chris looked over at me inquisitively.
Have you chosen yet, Madeline?
Truthfully, I hadn't. I'd been too busy analyzing my circumstances and mentally berating myself. I tapped the menu with my fingernail and took a deep breath. I suppose I'll have the chicken tenders and the Greek salad. I said with a half smile.
Very good. And you, sir?
Chris hadn't so much as glanced at the menu.
I'll have the usual, please, Frank.
Certainly, sir.
The waiter nodded and turned to the next table. I watched the interaction dumbfounded. What do you mean, the usual? I demanded. I thought this place only just opened. He grinned, baring his teeth.
Tonight's the opening night. I own it.
My jaw dropped. You own it? But then, why did you apply for the position? He sighed and looked down at the table, clearly ill at ease.
I am the owner, Madeline, not an employee. It's still the early days, and this place cost a small fortune to open.
Of course, that makes sense. I stared at my drink, my cheeks prickling.
I'll get us another bottle.
He stood up and walked over to the bar. With each sip of wine, I could feel the professional setting fading away into oblivion. He told me about his childhood summers spent in his aunt's ranch, and I told him about my ex-boyfriend Jimmy and how his proclamation of undying love had literally killed our relationship. We were just about to get started on our dinner when Chris looked at me quizzically.
Do you have any allergies?
There was an edge of seriousness to his voice, but it took me a moment to realize he wasn't joking. What? Not that I know of, I stuttered. His expression was grave.
My late wife had severe reactions to certain
He hesitated, searching for a suitable word.
irritants.
Oh, was all I could manage. I'm so sorry. The conversation dwindled away into silence. I didn't know you were married, I said after a short pause. I realized this wasn't the wisest thing to say given the circumstances. After all, why wouldn't he be married?
For a couple of years.
He specified.
She passed away last month. I found it exceedingly difficult to deal with.
I couldn't believe how quickly the conversation had shifted. I stared down at my half-empty glass, wondering what I could possibly say to make things better. I could feel him watching me intently.
I apologize. It's been tough.
No, I understand, I said, mortified. Is there anything I can do? I meant this, of course, as a gesture of kindness. I knew I had no prospects of soothing a grieving man's conscience, but a shadow momentarily crossed his features.
Let me cook for you tomorrow night.
I arrived at his house at about 7 p.m. the following evening. I'd stopped by a liquor store on the way and bought a bottle of wine that I'd hoped would complement the meal. I wasn't at all sure why I felt compelled to do this, or why I felt so drawn to this man despite my strict stance against office romances. I suppose I felt bad about the way things had turned out the previous night and couldn't bring myself to revoke the support I had already offered. It was a semi-modern 2-story building surrounded by trees and juniper shrubs. I parked my car in the driveway and started up the stone steps leading to the front door. I rang the doorbell, and within moments, Chris greeted me with a happy smile and ushered me inside. I handed him the bottle of wine apprehensively.
Thank you, Madeline. This'll work perfectly.
He was wearing an apron over a gray crew neck.
Dinner's almost ready.
I took off my coat and reached for the rack. Smells good. What is it?
It's a surprise. My specialty.
He chuckled, disappearing into the kitchen. His house wasn't exactly what I had been expecting. I had imagined a modern interior, minimalist furniture, and abstract paintings. Instead, his living space looked, well, lived in. Books were strewn across the coffee table, and glass mugs sat in seemingly objectable places. I perched on the couch, taking in my surroundings, when Chris came waltzing in through the door carrying 2 glasses of wine.
Oh, my apologies for the mess.
He said, collecting the books and sticking them back into a random bookshelf.
Ran out of time to clean.
You should see my apartment. I sipped the wine happily as he dashed from one side of the room to the other, like a hurricane, but picking things up in its wake. You have a lovely home. He halted for a second.
Thank you. It was my wife's. She always took such great care of it.
I tensed up, not wanting to repeat last night's conversation. What's this? I pointed to a book on the coffee table, hoping it would serve as a worthwhile distraction. It was open on a page with pictures of wires and gadgets I didn't know the names of. He suddenly seemed flustered.
Oh, that's just an old wilderness survival manual I found in the garage a while ago.
he said, snatching it off the table and shoving it into a bookshelf. Then he straightened up and smiled.
Would you care to accompany me to the dining room?
As I sat down on one of the cushioned chairs in the dining room, Chris came in carrying 2 steaming plates and set them down on the table in front of me.
I do hope you enjoy it, Madeline. This recipe has been in my family for many decades.
I stared at the plate of food. It looked like a slab of meat with a side of mashed potatoes and garden salad. Chris was eyeing me intently as he sat across from me, picking up his utensils.
Well, tuck in.
I arranged my expression into what I'd hoped was a friendly smile. It looks absolutely delicious. Might I ask what it is? Chris looks blasé as ever as he shoveled food into his mouth.
It's a type of filet mignon. Madeline, I must say, your taste in wine is impeccable.
He raised his glass for a toast, but I sat, unmoving, suddenly overcome with an overwhelming urge to gag. The meat looked dense and colorless in the center, and the smell was faintly off-putting. Chris was looking at me curiously now, his arms still up in the air. I started to panic. Was this what he had meant when he'd asked about my allergies? Sorry, could I use your bathroom, please? I tried my best to sound casual. He nodded mid-chew.
It's down the hall. First door on the left.
I nodded and scurried away as nonchalantly as my gut would allow. As soon as I was out of sight, I darted towards the front door. My pulse was throbbing in my throat as I grabbed my belongings and tried the handle. It was locked. My heart dropped. Of course it was locked. What was I expecting? I could still hear the indistinct clicking of utensils coming from the dining room. He was distracted. I still had some time. I stalked down the corridor and tried the first door on the left. It was the bathroom, but to my dismay, it had no windows. I shut the door as meticulously as I could and tried the next one down. It led to a flight of stairs leading to what I can only imagine was the basement. My heart leapt in my chest as I recalled parking my car in front of the garage. I knew this was my way out. I shut the door behind me and felt for the light switch. I found it in the form of a string dangling above my head. As I climbed down the stairs, I started to feel sick again. A putrid smell of rot was radiating from the basement and instantly reminded me of the food that was still awaiting my return from the bathroom. The downstairs was cluttered with boxes, recycling bags, and general trinkets that hadn't qualified for upstairs. I made my way to the only available door, navigating the obstacle course as carefully as I could. I pushed it open, only to be hit with an overwhelming surge of rancid stench. I coughed and sputtered, covering my face with my hands as I gasped for air. I wish I had kept my eyes covered. An elongated steel platform stood in the middle of the room. A fluorescent lamp hung over it, enveloping everything in brilliant light. A woman lay flat on her back on the steel surface, her arms outstretched to her sides and hanging limply in the air. Her eyes were shut, and her body covered with a white plastic sheet. A lineup of utensils was neatly arranged on a small tray beside her, and the smell rising from underneath the sheet blatantly gave away her condition.
I see you've met my wife.
I turned abruptly to see Chris standing in the doorway. His tone was icy cold and his eyes piercing.
Couldn't find the bathroom?
I gawked at him, blood draining from my face. He seemed to be staring straight into the depths of my soul.
Didn't care for the steak?
The corners of his mouth twitched. My own mouth felt as dry as a cotton ball. Please, I whispered. He raised his eyebrows at my request.
Oh, it's still there if you'd like it. I can bring it down if you'd like a change of scenery.
Let me go, I croaked.
You are free to go any time you'd like. Just not the way you came.
My blood ran cold. Here I was, in the garage of a man I met only yesterday morning, a man I had agreed to hire, a man I had ultimately trusted. How had I ended up here in this situation, in a room with a corpse, in a plate full of mystery meat I didn't even want to think about? I knew I was, in all likelihood, going to die. It was only a matter of when and how, because I no longer had the element of surprise. He knew I didn't have a choice. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I lifted my chin and whispered, "May I finish my dinner?" I trudged up the basement stairs with him inches behind me. He was breathing down my neck, watching my every move. My entire life kept flashing before my eyes, making me sick to my stomach, but I knew there was no way he'd allow me to use the bathroom again unsupervised. How could I have been so gullible? Because I had so carelessly betrayed my own values and morals, I'd be forcefully subjected to a similar fate as the woman I'd seen downstairs. Perhaps it was the inescapable nature of my circumstances, or the sound of his footsteps directly behind me that awakened my instincts. As we approached the top step, I turned on my heel and shoved him as hard as my frigid limbs would allow. There was a muffled thud as his back hit the concrete floor. Without hesitation, I slammed the basement door shut and reached for the lock. But of course, there was no key. Frantically, I flew into the dining room where I left my phone on the table. My serving was still there, looking as gray as ever, but my phone was gone. He'd taken it. I scoured the room for anything I could use. My utensils were still on the table, and I clutched them to my chest protectively. A few moments later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Thud, thud, thud. His steps were in sync with my heartbeat. I hid behind the bathroom door, leaving a barely visible crack to see. The footsteps came to a halt and the basement door swung open. Chris towered in the doorway, a mocking expression on his face.
Madeline!
He barked and limped into the living room, disappearing from my line of sight and causing my pulse to pick up in anticipation.
Come out, wherever you are.
He was making fun of me. It was all a game to him. I wondered how many other young women had hidden in this very same room and how many of them had seen how the game ended. I clutched the knife and fork closer to my chest. It was only a matter of time before he found me. My stomach lurched at the thought. But the house was dead silent. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own muffled breathing. It felt like minutes had ticked by without a single indication of movement. I prayed the bathroom door wouldn't creak as I pushed it open slowly, half expecting him to pounce and yell, "Peekaboo!" But he didn't. I tiptoed slowly up the stairs to the second floor and tried the first door on the landing. There was a bed in the center of the room and a wardrobe against the left wall. A sudden waft of breeze caressed my flushed skin, and I noticed one of the windows was slightly ajar. I darted towards it in a daze and looked down at the dark street. It was about 20 feet from the ground, and the driveway was paved, not a blade of grass in sight. I looked around desperately and noticed a rain pipe on the right-hand side of the window pane.
Madeline?
He sounded irate now, and I knew the game was nearing its end. I jolted the window open and scrambled onto the windowsill. The ground looked so far away it made my skin crawl.
I'm coming up!
I panicked. My fingers were trembling and my sweaty palms wouldn't allow me to hold onto the pipe firmly enough. Loud, deliberate footsteps came from the stairs, making me shrivel up in fear. I was out of time and out of options. It was either this or the tools in the basement. The door was suddenly kicked open with a loud bang. Chris charged into the room, a shark smile on his face. His eyes widened when he saw my legs dangling from the edge.
What the?
He started, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I shut my eyes and propelled myself from the second-story window. The wind swooshed through my hair and into my lungs. Then my legs hit the ground and all I could see was darkness. I knelt there for a few seconds, mentally accounting for any damage. There was a dull pain in my right leg, but I brushed it off for a bruise. I looked up at the window I had jumped from. The curtains were swinging loosely in the wind, but there was no sign of him. Alarmed, I struggled to my feet. The pain was more acute as I limped hurriedly towards the main street, turning my head to look back at the front door every few seconds, hastening my pace against the protests of my pulse. Suddenly, there was a screech of tires and a myriad of blinding lights, and then everything went black. I woke up in a white hospital bed, hooked up to several translucent tubes. The sun rays danced on my face, and I raised my arm to shield my eyes. On the other side of the room, a nurse was fervently rummaging through a cupboard. She raised her head at the sound of shifting sheets.
Oh, good, you're awake.
She said with a quick smile. What happened? My voice sounded tiny and subdued. A look of surprise briefly crossed her features.
You don't recall?
I shook my head.
You had a little run-in with a vehicle and broke your leg.
She said apologetically.
The driver called for an ambulance, but you had no form of identification on you, so we couldn't contact your family, I'm afraid. Would you like to phone them?
I nodded, dazed. As soon as she was out of sight, I sat up, scanning my surroundings. I had a pounding headache, and the bright white interior was irritating my eyes. I noticed a gift box sitting on the bedside table. I peered at it unsurely. Hadn't the nurse said that nobody knew who I was? How could I possibly get a gift? Innocuously, I picked it up and examined the tag. For Madeline. Get well soon, it read. I tore away the wrapping paper. Inside was a plain brown box with the words, Bon Appetit, engraved across the top in gold lettering. I had seen similar designs at the local patissier. I admired it for a few moments, and then took off the lid. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching. Just wanted to thank my patrons, Tam B, Jen Miser, Sky Mara Ravenswood, Melissa Perez, Mr. Sankofa, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Neon Scoundrel, and William Delphin. If you'd like to become a patron, join my Discord, or see my other social media, check out the links in the description below. Also, let me know how I can be praying for you. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next video.